Hello and welcome. Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. I'm quite excited to see such a great turnout. So I looked at the participant list and we have participants from all over the world. And I'm quite excited because we are bringing together two important and crucial hot topics of the moment: AUTOSAR security and the building blocks AUTOSAR brings, and UNECE adequate security and how to achieve an adequate security level. I'm presenting today with two colleagues who are experts in both of these fields, in AUTOSAR, respectively, in VTA and vehicle type approval. So let us quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Moritz Winslav, Senior Manager at ESCRYPT. I've spent more than 10 years now in cybersecurity, most of the time with ESCRYPT focusing on automotive security with clients, OEMs, suppliers, big and small, also worldwide, and with a special focus on cybersecurity management, developing and advancing the cyber maturity of organizations. And in that role, I'm also ESCRYPT's current business owner for our security consulting services.
Yeah, hi, my name is Marcel Rücker. I'm working as a security consultant also at ESCRYPT. The focus of my work is currently on automotive security, where I'm also consulting OEMs and suppliers worldwide. Furthermore to that, I'm also concerned with industrial security for production. And yeah, as you know, these topics sometimes overlap. That's then particularly interesting for me. And yes, I'm also offering the vehicle type approval readiness assessment service here at ESCRYPT. So then I hand over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Marcel. Hi, I'm Michael Schneider. I'm working as a project manager at ESCRYPT, where I'm working in projects for providing security consulting for ECUs and for the whole vehicle. My special focus is on AUTOSAR security features, where I'm also a member of the AUTOSAR working group for security.
Thank you, Michael and myself, for the quick introduction. So let's have a look at the agenda. We have three main sections. The first one will be me talking about adequate security in face of regulation. This is just a brief starter to set the scene and set the stage for Marcel and Michael to then do a deep dive. Marcel will, in section 2, talk about planning adequate security with Annex 5. So this Annex 5 of the UN regulation is one of the corner pieces that we'll hear about today, and he will tell us all about how to plan for this. In section 3 then, continued by Michael, we'll hear about, with AUTOSAR to UNECE-compliant cybersecurity, so how to use the AUTOSAR security building blocks to achieve this security level that was planned, for example, using the approach discussed in section 2. We'll have a brief wrap-up, also presented by Michael, and then we'll dive into a Q&A. And I already saw that there are pre-submitted questions from you, so keep them coming. We'll have some time at the end to answer those. And with that, let's get started. So first section, adequate security in face of regulation. So over the time at ESCRYPT, we witnessed really an evolution of what cybersecurity means and what adequate security means. So in the past, it was mostly about looking at individual ECUs. Manipulation protection was a big topic, and this progressed and this changed. So let's say around the 2000s, the focus and the scope was an entire vehicle system. And now with the advent of connected vehicles, automated driving, the scope actually grows much larger, and it's the entire infrastructure with V2X communication, with backend services and backend servers, and so on. And what happens from a security point of view, we have increasing system complexity, we have increasing connectivity, and we have increasing vulnerability and exposure to cyber attacks. And this means also this adequate security level kept, of course, changing and it evolved, and how to achieve it evolved. So in the past, it was mostly relying on expert knowledge, what I would call the hero mode. So individuals with a really deep insight and deep knowledge of all the technical details. As the scope grew and the systems became larger that had to be considered for cybersecurity, many organizations defined processes and roles that continued this topic, that led the topic, and that spread the topic within the organization. And what's happening now, we are again at another, let's say, turning point or changing point with two things that are happening. First is this change of scope again with the infrastructure that is coming increasingly into scope. So many organizations are now embarking on setting up a holistic cybersecurity management system, really looking at end-to-end security from the deeply embedded ECUs all the way to related and connected backend servers. And to some extent, hand in hand goes, or another development is happening, mandatory security requirements coming down with regulation like the UNR 155, which I want to talk about now for a couple of minutes. This UN regulation has basically a global impact. It is already required from 2022 on in EU and Japan. And on the left-hand side, you see a world map of countries that could also potentially pick up this UN regulation and make it mandatory. So looking at that, a huge potential or huge part of the automotive worldwide market is impacted or might be impacted by this UN regulation. There are some exceptions, of course. You see some big markets that are not part of this, the US, India, China, and so on. But there is actually a separate development happening at the UNWP29. The same content of this UN Regulation 155 is being translated into the context of a different international agreement. It's a so-called UN GTR that's in development. There are also some national legislations happening with similar requirements. And you see on the right-hand side, the contracting parties of the 1998 agreement. So these are the countries that could potentially pick up a UN GTR. And by looking at this, it becomes clear that this mandatory security, this adequate security in face of regulation, is really a global topic affecting OEMs and suppliers worldwide. A key piece of this regulation, the UN Regulation 155, is the Annex 5. And I'm quoting here from the regulation, the section 734. And I'm quoting the bold part in the middle. The mitigations implemented, so the security mitigations that need to protect road users and vehicles. The mitigations implemented shall include all mitigations referred to in Annex 5, Part B and C, which are relevant for the risk identified. So the mitigations need to be relevant for the risk identified. So this is one of the corner pieces of the regulation. Everything needs to be risk-based and there needs to be a rationale for what to do. But it also says this Annex 5 has a key place in here. So this Annex 5 needs to be considered. So what is Annex 5? Marcel will dive into this much more in detail, but just for a starter, it's a list of 24 mitigations against risks. And these risks are actually based on a threat catalog, which is the Annex 5 Part A. And they're fairly high level, so the mitigations itself often need interpretation. And this is now the perfect time to hand over to Marcel, who will take a deep dive, take us into the details of this Annex 5 Part B and C and Part A, and how now to assess the technical gap of an EE architecture versus what's in there. So Marcel, please continue.
Yeah, thank you, Moritz. Yeah, and let's start with the second part of this talk, planning adequate security using the Annex 5. So as Moritz already said, it's a good start to have a closer look into Annex 5, which will be elucidated. So what's Annex 5 in detail? Moritz already told us it's actually considering of basically two parts. So the first part, Part A, is a threat catalog. And here on the right side, I have brought an example to you to a little bit explain more how it is structured. So the threats are categorized in very high level categories. So the example here is threats to vehicles regarding their communication channels. And you can see this is a very broad spectrum. So this does not specify which communication channel we are looking at and not already specifying neither which kind of threats there are. And this is more broken down further to a sub-level that's a little bit more specific. So the sub-level here, one I picked as an example, is spoofing of messages, data received by the vehicle. So you can also see here it's still a little bit vague and just categorizing the kind of attack or threats that we can have here. And this is then even broken down further to really specific attacks. So this example that I brought you here is spoofing of messages by impersonation. For example, during V2X communication, platooning or localization data. The second part that the mitigation catalogs consists of, the Annex 5 consists of, is a mitigation catalogs for threats, and it is split in two areas. So The first, part B, is for threats, mitigations for threats intended to the vehicle type. And I've also brought an example here to you. If we take on the left side of this block, the example threat that we already know now is spoofing of messages by impersonation during platooning or localization data. And a proper mitigation that is suggested by the Annex 5 is the vehicle shall verify the authenticity and integrity of messages it receives. And as Moritz already mentioned, so this is more it's a little vague, so you have a lot of this leaves room for interpretation. So it's not prescribing a detailed technical implementation. It is more a high-level requirement that you have to consider here. The second part from the mitigation catalog is part C, that is more focused on areas outside the vehicle. So for example, backend, if you consider connected vehicles, or also might be considering other vehicles if you talk about V2V communication here. An example threat from the Annex 5 would be unauthorized internet access to the server, enabled, for example, by backdoors, unpatched system software, SQL attacks, and so on. And the mitigation that is suggested here is security controls are applied to backend systems to minimize authorized access. Example security can be found in the Open Web Application Security project. So here again, we see it leaves a very broad space on what's actually to be implemented. So the Open Web Application Security project lists lots of different technical measures that you can use for backend system. So this is what we should keep in mind. It's high level, and we have to identify the technical concept here that we have to use to implement such a mitigation that we have to consider according to the regulation. So what does this, you can see also that on the right side I have used different coloring. So since we are focusing on the vehicle type here, since we are about type approval, especially part A and part B are relevant. So the mitigations in part C concerning outside the vehicle areas is also important and should be considered, but is often not so much specific for a specific vehicle type. If you think about it, for OEMs might have backend systems that might be relevant for multiple vehicle types. So if you talk about a specific vehicle type, then part A and part B are the most interesting parts here. And yes, as I already mentioned and Moritz already introduced, the regulation requires us that we consider Annex 5 during the development of a specific vehicle type. So what does this mean? The takeaway message here, the threats of Part A, we have to use in an exhaustive risk assessment. So these threats have to be considered at least in a risk assessment. And the mitigations that we see here have to be also considered as adequate security measures and on a high level, because they leave room for interpretation. But this is what we have to do according to the regulation. Moritz already mentioned that there are 24 mitigations that are listed in the Annex Part B and C. And yeah, as you can imagine, if you consider a modern vehicle architecture, which has from 50 up to over 100 components, implementing 24 security measures for all of those components could be very costly and takes lots of effort. So this leaves us the question, which mitigations do we have to implement for vehicle type? And here the interpretation document that was released with the UN regulation gives us a little bit more explanation what's the target of this requirement, what the target of the requirement actually is. You can see here that it is the most important thing, it's also bold in the quotation, is that it is about the rationality. So it is actually not required to implement all of those mitigation, but rather to provide recent arguments and evidence why the selected requirements that we implemented for a certain component are appropriate to the risk that were identified. So it's much more important to have a good argumentation why the mitigations can be sufficient. And if we think about the hero mode that Moritz mentioned earlier, which has especially been practiced in the past, so this is nothing, not an approach that would lead us to a good rationale, right? So if experts, experts with very much knowledge just might select some mitigations, in technical measures, this is not very structured. This gives you not a reasoned argument or good evidence that you will have to use later for the type approval. So this is why we should look here for another a way to do it. And a good idea which also generates a rationale that you can lose later is to use a systematic approach if you want to identify the appropriate mitigations. And yeah, this is what we want to show you here, one idea for a systematic approach. So let's wrap this up in the next step, what we basically have to do according to the Annex 5 or the regulation for a vehicle architecture. So here on the left side, you see a schematic e-architecture, which on a security perspective is basically representing a specific vehicle type. Sorry. So the first thing that we have to do that is required by the regulation is that we have to identify the critical elements of the vehicle type and perform an exhaustive risk assessment. And as I already mentioned, also considering the threats of Annex 5 Part A. So this basically means we have to analyze all of the components in the architecture and identify if there are potential security gaps. So this would be the first step that we have to do. The second step, of course, is then if we know which elements are critical and which potential security gaps we have to implement adequate security mechanisms to close those gaps. And hereby provide a rationale, consider the mitigations of Part B and C, and provide a rationale, as I said, to with reasoned arguments why we selected the mitigations that we have. The third step that we will have to do is actually important for the type approval. So we as have to demonstrate that the cybersecurity was adequately considered during the development phase. So it's not just sufficient to make a risk assessment and select some security controls, but it's also important that we have a process that validates that the gaps and security mechanisms that we selected are correct. So that we didn't make any mistake or miss something out. So this is very important here. So if you have a look at these three activity blocks or sets of activities, so to say, you can easily imagine that if you do this for 50 to over 100 components, this takes lots of time and resources. So this is something that we really have to plan because it takes a lot of time. And as Moritz already mentioned, so the regulation will be applied in July 22 for existing vehicle types in July 24. So this is, we don't have so much time if we want to be ready for a type approval that considers the regulation 155. So planning at an early stage is really important here. If you imagine that a thorough security engineering process takes approximately from 6 months to 24 months, we even get a more accurate picture that we will not have so much time until the regulation will be applied. So this is basically a question that we need to answer here. How much time and how many resources are required to be ready for the type approval if we want to fulfill the requirements that the regulation gives us? And this is actually where Annex 5 can be used to derive a systematic approach that we can use to exactly solve this problem. So if you start up with a E-architecture, a vehicle type, what we need to know to have a good plan at the beginning, at an early stage, is that we need to know the technical gaps that might exist in our E-architecture that we have to close to be compliant to the regulation. And what we also want to know is how much budget will we need to close those technical gaps, because this is what we require to plan on how many experts will we need that work on this topic, that we don't end up and all the developers, for example, are already assigned to other projects and we cannot achieve the goal anymore. So this is actually the question that we want to answer here with the systematic approach. So how can we just take the E-architecture and get to an overview of the budget and the technical gap? I wrapped up the challenge that we have here on the left side again for you to make it more clear. So we already have seen security activities require usually time and resources. So the budget for those activities is usually allocated rather scarce. So to use it efficient is very important. And yeah, if you want to use a budget very efficient, it is necessary to do a good planning. So to allocate the budget good and properly at an early stage. So And a little kind of interesting thing here is that budget planning, so the information that we need to have to make a good budget planning would also be a result of security activities. So if you consider a threat and risk analysis that we have to do if we want to comply with the regulation and do a thorough security engineering process, that would also give us some insight on what kind of security measures we would have to implement for a component. But the problem here is that those activities, if you consider again 50 to over 100 components, are usually not finished at an early stage. So this takes probably too long to wait if those activities are already ready to give us some insight here. So this is why it is a good idea to use a high level approach, an architectural approach to estimate a budget and identify the technical gaps. And this is what we actually want to show you here today. So the approach that we will present is also consists of the 3 steps that can be basically mapped to the requirements of the regulation that I shown you before. So the first step would be to identify potential critical elements on an architectural level. The second point would be to assign adequate security controls to close exactly these gaps. And these 2 steps already give us an overview of potential security gaps within our architecture and also allows budget estimation, since we can use security controls that are standardized. And the third step, as I told you, is very, very much important, that we have to validate that those critical elements and security controls are accurate. And this we can do by the artifacts that are generated by a security engineering process. And yeah, a little disclaimer. So this approach that we show here is actually also used in the vehicle type approval readiness assessment that we offer by ESCRYPT as a service. So let's start with the first step. As you can see on the right upper side, there's our EE architecture, and yeah, there's a little flag written criticality indicators, and you already can see that some of the elements of the architecture are already colored in. So criticality indicators is the first tool that we will use in our analysis here. So what are criticality indicators? Criticality indicators are basically criteria to identify the potential critical elements on an architectural level. So the criteria that we use here are on the one hand derived from the UN regulation and interpretation document, who already gives some hints what elements of an AE architecture might be critical. So for example, if you consider components that have some interfaces to the internet or external communication or are safety critical. So these are probably elements that might be considered critical on a security perspective as well. And of course, we also use our long time experience at ESCRYPT to generate those criticality indicators. Since we have much experience in analyzing E architectures and components and securing them, of course. And yeah, as the name already reveals, those indicators, criticality indicators, are only indicating that the component is potentially affected of the threats by Annex 5. So we have a mapping here from the criticality indicators to the threats already. Maybe to give you an example, so one criticality indicator that we actually use is steering, is classified as affiliated with vehicle safety. And if you have a component that intervenes in steering, or in case of a sensor on actual sending or receiving sensitive data for steering, this is a clear indicator that it might be critical to security. More concrete examples are electric power steering, of course. I think that's obvious. And yeah, brake control, if you think about adaptive cruise control or systems like that, where the brake has to send and receive signals to the vehicle in-vehicle network. Some more example that give you a little more understanding what the criticalities also can be is, for example, immobilizer. So if a component is involved in immobilizer implementation, classified as theft protection, this would also be considered as critical, since if it's getting compromised, then the vehicle could easily be stolen. Next one here, you can see a sensitive onboard communication. So if a module is, for example, sending or receiving privacy relevant data or gathering vehicle data, this would be considered as sensitive communication. Then it's also an indicator that this is critical to cybersecurity according to the regulation. And yeah, the last example I think is pretty obvious. I already mentioned it. If you have a module that is having external connectivity or routing inside the vehicle network, this is also an indication that this could be critical to cybersecurity. Okay. The next step that we will do is that we apply security controls that are technical concepts mitigating the criticality indicator. As you can see on the right, we have this protection symbol here, so that we will map the security controls to those critical elements that we identified. Yes, as already said, technical measures to close identified gaps, but rather on a conceptual level. And they're directly responding to the threats that are associated with the criticality indicators, and this means the threats of the Annex 5. The advantage here is that we can use security controls that are standardized, and this allows us to make actually a budget estimation. So if you think about the mitigation catalog, they are vague or abstract concepts. It would be hard to make an estimation for that. What budget would be required? But if you use security controls that we know about, that are standardized, we can easily do an estimation here. What are the costs implemented for a component? I've also have some examples here for you. So the first one would be flash write protection. So the protection of the flash memory of a microcontroller, for example, or a complete module. And yeah, the goal is clear: preventing unauthorized pre-programming of the module. And yeah, two criticality indicators that are associated with this is steering. So if you have a module concerned with steering, we don't want malicious software running here and affecting vehicle safety. And also for immobilizer, I think it's pretty obvious. If someone can change the software from the immobilizer implementation, the vehicle can easily be stolen. This is what we do not want. An example threat that is is covered here by the security control is, for example, introduce malicious software or malicious software activities. So as I already said, this is what can be prevented by flash write protection. Further example for security controls that we use is secure diagnostics. So securing, for example, OBD connections that no data gets leaked here, or that also no malicious software is introduced. Interface hardening, so basically removing interfaces that are not needed, or if an interface is needed, for example, JTAG for debugging, then introduce sufficient cryptographic measures to protect it, for example. And the next example is secure communication, which is also very important if you imagine for components that are sending and receiving sensitive data in the vehicle network. We want to ensure that the communication is secured, for example, by introducing cryptographic measures to protect integrity, confidentiality, and availability of the messages. Okay, this leaves us to the third step. So with the first two steps, we already are able to make an estimation on an architectural level what kind of budget we will require. So if you think about, if we have an E-architecture with over 100 components, by using the criticality indicators, we maybe can already reduce this number to 70. So this makes a real difference, since it's 30 components for example, less that we have to implement security controls for, that we have to do a thorough security engineering process. And this is actually the last step of the approach. So as you can see on the right side, the security artifacts are actually here to validate the first two steps. So what are security artifacts? As I already said, the criticality indicators and security controls helps us to set up a thorough security engineering process for those identified elements. And the security engineering process consists of different security activities. To do it like this, if you consider again the hero mode that Moritz introduced at the beginning, it is mandatory to do it in a structured process for holistic security that is concerning the whole life cycle. So if we just have a couple of experts that are assigning technical measures to the components. This is can be problematic if you want to concern the whole life cycle and if you think about holistic security. So it's always really important that you have a structured and reasoned process to do it. So this is mandatory here. And security artifacts are basically the resulting work products of those processes. So if you finish the a security activity, you always will end up with some kind of work product where you have documented what you have done, what you have implemented. And yeah, this is really important. And since we should anyway do a security engineering process, the security artifacts is nothing but we have to create additionally. So we should have it anyway if we do a thorough engineering process. And yeah, as I mentioned, we can use it if we use our systematic approach that we present here to validate that our potential critical elements that we identified and the security controls are correct and accurate. And this is actually the basis to demonstrate that security is adequately considered during the type approval. So if you recall, the last requirement was also that we have to demonstrate in type approval that the security was adequately considered, and this can be supported or should be done by also providing proper documentation so that we can show and confirm that we did structured processes, that we have considered all elements, that we have selected security controls and so on. Yes, so this is why the security artifacts are required anyway. I have here a selection of very important security artifacts on our perspective that are needed anyways. If you also consider the ISO 21434, for example, there's many more work products that will be created during a security engineering process, but these 6 here are really relevant in our opinion, and this is why I want to show it here to you. So the first thing that you should always do for all components is a security relevance assessment. So decide if the kind of like with the criticality indicators, but more in detail, which of the components are relevant to security. And for those that you identified as relevant for security, you of course have to do a threat and risk analysis, which is also required by the regulation, to identify the security gaps, of course, but in more detail than with our high-level approach here. And of course, if you have identified the security gaps, you have to specify a security concept, to specify technical measures to close those gaps, and plan an implementation, of course. Then the next step would be to create a proper security testing concept that ensures that all of our the implemented measures are adequately tested, checked, validated, verified, so that we can ensure that we didn't miss here anything. And of course, resulting from that is a security testing report that confirms that all of our tests, that we passed all of our tests like we expected. And after all, at the end, we should also always do a security release that is a validation and confirms that we have performed all of those activity in the project, did the activities correctly and didn't miss anything here. And maybe also important to say here, it's in those activities these are not one-time activities. We always have to think about them in a loop. So if you're really in a security testing report, for example, that some tests have failed, or you identify that some of the threats are not addressed adequately, then you of course have to do it again. So this is more, it's not like a waterfall model. You have to imagine it more as activities in a loop, so to say. And here another note to underline our approach a little bit. So as I already said, the presented systematic approach should more be seen as preceding and complementing a thorough security process, or target it to the correct elements of an e-architecture. So you definitely always have to do a security engineering process for all critical elements to be ready for the type approval. So at the end, I want to show you all of this on a short example. to make it a little bit more clear maybe. So here we have an ECU that is used for body control. So the basic functionality is it can centrally lock and unlock the doors of the car. It is also in control of the windows. And here the maybe functionality that is most relevant or interesting on security point of view is it is also able to do an authentication of a remote key. So if we consider the locking and unlocking of the car and the authentication process, we can easily say, okay, this component is probably involved in the immobilizer implementation. So as I said, the classification would be theft protection. And yes, so this is something that we can easily identify with our criticality indicators without having to make a deeper analysis of this component actually. So this would be the advantage here. And yeah, with this criticality indicator, we also already get some associated threats that are have to be considered from the Annex 5. The two that I've selected here is introduce malicious software, malicious activity. We've already seen that before, and malicious internal canvas messages. So these are two threats to probably all the modules that are involved in the immobilize implementation. And next step is to select adequate security controls. The first one would be flash write protection, as in our example before, so we can prevent that malicious software is introduced. And the second one that we can select here is secure communication. So to secure the CAN messages that no malicious messages will be sent, that we protect confidentiality, integrity, and authenticity where it is needed. So I mentioned to you before the benefit of using these standardized security controls is that it allows us a budget estimation. And of course, we can go a little step further. So if we think, for example, about secure communication, there's possibilities to optimize the budget. So if we think about communication always involves more components, so it is possible that we can centralize an implementation here so that we don't have to do it for each component, but make a centralized implementation that can be used within the complete architecture. And this would be a good measure to optimize the budget. And the second point here is we can always, or we should always look that we can use already deployed technology. And AUTOSAR, as will Michael show you in a minute, is a very, very good example for that, because AUTOSAR already has some very good features that will support you in implementing security controls. So maybe to have a short conclusion about the section. So what did we do? We had a look at the Annex 5 and have seen that we can use it as basis for a systematic approach actually to make a risk assessment, or not a risk assessment, but to identify critical elements and select adequate security control. Yes, this can furthermore then be used to a budget planning at a very early stage on an architectural level that allows us to actually set up a targeted security engineering process so that we can identify which elements we have to plan for a security engineering process and which we don't. And one measure to then use the budget smart is to reuse already available technologies, for example. So there's many more, but this is a really good approach. And AUTOSAR is a perfect example for this, as we'll see in a minute. And maybe again, so the defined approach we present here today is we already defined this as a service here at ESCRYPT using 8 criticality indicators, 10 security controls, and of course, as I mentioned, this already includes a mapping to the threats of Annex 5. And for the technical implementation, I hand over to you, Michael, who will show us now how we can do this with AUTOSAR.
Thank you, Marcel. So I will present you now the third part of our webinar with the title With AUTOSAR to UNECE-compliant cybersecurity. First of all, I would like to give you a very brief introduction into AUTOSAR and what it actually is. So AUTOSAR is a standardized middleware for automotive ECUs, which comes in two variants nowadays, Classic and Adaptive AUTOSAR. Classic AUTOSAR is focusing on typical automotive use cases like safety and real-time, whereas Adaptive AUTOSAR is focusing more on the new emerging use cases like the connected vehicle. So it's more focusing on performance while still providing safety to a certain extent. Now I would like to point out that adaptive AUTOSAR is not meant to replace classic AUTOSAR, but both are meant to coexist next to each other. In fact, both can even coexist within one ECU, as we can see on the right-hand side, where we have an example architecture of a vehicle computer, which consists of a microcontroller and a microprocessor. The microcontroller hosts an instance of classic AUTOSAR, which is running applications with high safety requirements. And on the microprocessor, we can see that there's a hypervisor running, which in turn hosts different instances of different OSs. So we can see here again, one instance of classic AUTOSAR for the safety-related use cases. And we have two adaptive AUTOSAR instances that could be focused on different domains like B2X communication or automated driving. And you could even have a non-AUTOSAR OS running on your hypervisor, for instance, a Linux platform that is running applications with low safety requirements. So why should I use AUTOSAR to implement the UNR 55 requirements? First of all, AUTOSAR is an industry standard that is widely used in current vehicles and that is also broadly accepted within the automotive market. Second, AUTOSAR provides standardized security building blocks that are readily available to implement the UNR 155 requirements. And third of all, AUTOSAR is used in the industry for over a decade, so it's also used in existing architectures, which makes AUTOSAR also a good starting point for retrofitting activities. Okay, let's now have a look at the security building blocks that are offered by AUTOSAR. I would like to start with the crypto stack because that's the most straightforward security building block because it provides applications with access to cryptographic primitives and it also supports you in key management. So this is the module that basically every application uses that wants to encrypt or sign some data. This module is used by the secure communication module. So AUTOSAR supports a number of secure communication protocols like TLS and IPsec for automotive Ethernet, and also SecOC. And I would like to also point out SecOC here because SecOC was designed and specified within the AUTOSAR consortium, targeting specifically automotive bus systems like CAN, for instance. The next security building block I would like to talk about is secure diagnostic access. So AUTOSAR supports you also in securing your diagnostic interfaces via the UDS services 27, Secure Access, and 29, Authentication. Another method for access control is the Identity and Access Management module. However, this is not working on diagnostic interfaces, but it's running on an application level where it controls the access of applications to critical interfaces, for instance, to communication channels or cryptographic keys. One module that was only recently added within the release 2011 from last year is the IDSM module, which stands for Intrusion Detection System Manager. And what this module does, it collects security events that are raised within the AUTOSAR stack. It aggregates them, filters and qualifies them, and forwards these qualified security events to a central instance within the vehicle, which in turn forwards these events to the IDS backend, where a team of security experts is analyzing the events and deciding about countermeasures. One such countermeasure could be that you have to perform an update of your software running on your ECU, and AUTOSAR also supports you here. AUTOSAR supports you in securely updating your ECU on a granularity of individual applications or also of the complete platform. And finally, I would also like to highlight the trusted platform feature of AUTOSAR, which supports you in authenticating the software that is being run on your ECU by continuing the chain of trust, which originates by the ECU in the trust anchor. So I would also like to point out that most of these building blocks that we see here are available in both platforms. However, not all of them. Some are only limited to one of the two platforms. However, AUTOSAR is also working on harmonizing this such that the security building blocks are going to be available on both platforms. Okay, let's now have a look on how these security building blocks can help us in technically implementing the mitigations proposed by the Annex 5. You can see here a matrix that depicts this. On the left-hand side, you can see the mitigations that are listed in the Annex 5. And on the right-hand side, you can see the security building blocks offered by AUTOSAR. And we wanted to address the question, to what extent can the security building blocks offered by AUTOSAR actually implement the mitigations proposed by the UN R155? And we found out that you can categorize this into two categories. We have the category depicted with 1 point, which states that the security building block can support in implementing this mitigation. But we have also the category with 2 points, which states that this security building block really does address this mitigation and implements this mitigation already to a great extent. I would like to go more into detail here and present 2 examples in a minute. First of all, I would like to highlight also M3 and M23 because these 2 mitigations don't have any points at all. For M3, this is due to the fact that this mitigation is targeting security measures for backend systems, and AUTOSAR is a specification for an ECU firmware. So this mitigation cannot be addressed by AUTOSAR, so it's out of scope. M23 is targeting best practices for software and hardware development. And of course, none of these building blocks, of these functional building blocks can address this mitigation, but these building blocks have to be implemented according to these best practices. And for this, AUTOSAR supports you again because AUTOSAR provides you also with secure coding guidelines that can be used to implement these security building blocks in a secure way. Okay, let's now have a look at 2 examples for deeper analysis. So let's first have a look at the mitigation M10 that states that the vehicle shall verify the authenticity and integrity of messages it receives. So we are talking here about secure in-vehicle communication. I think that's a use case that's pretty common among the OEMs, and that was also already mentioned by Marcel during his part. For this mitigation, we can use the secure communication building block by AUTOSAR. So we can use the secure communication protocols, SecOC, TLS, and IPsec, and they can be used pretty much out of the box to address this mitigation. So this is the secure communication building block has been addressed with 2 points. However, I would also like to point out that it's not just sufficient to employ SecOC, but you have to use this in a proper way. So you have to perform a risk analysis in order to identify all the messages that needs to be secured. And after that, you have to properly configure the SecOC modules within your vehicle, also in a way that they support a high security level. The crypto stack as another security building block is a module that supports you here because the crypto stack provides the cryptographic primitives that are used for MAC generation, for instance. And it also supports you in the key management aspect, which is also a vital aspect of in-vehicle secure in-vehicle communication, because you have to manage the keys all over your vehicle and keep them synchronized. And I would also like to point out that the crypto stack is just an interface for accessing the primitives and the keys. However, in order to securely store the keys, it's also recommended to deploy additional security measures like hardware security by storing the keys in an HSM, for instance. So in order to wrap this up here, I think for this mitigation, the security building block, secure communication offered by AUTOSAR can be readily used to implement this mitigation. Okay, now let's have a look at another mitigation. Let's have a look at M18, which states that measures shall be implemented for defining and controlling user roles and access privileges based on the principle of least access privilege. So we're talking here about access control to critical interfaces. And AUTOSAR provides 2 modules here that can support you, which is on the one hand, secure diagnostics for securing diagnostic interfaces, and on the other hand, the identity and access management module, which can be used to control access of applications to critical interfaces like communication channels or cryptographic keys. However, I think both of these modules only target one specific aspect of access control, because when I would think about implementing this mitigation, I would think that an ECU offers more access interfaces that needs to be controlled. So these two modules can only play a role. They can support me here in implementing this mitigation, but I need more than these. So both of them are assessed with 1 point. Okay, let's now take one step back again and have a look at the complete matrix. And let's ask ourselves the question again, to what extent can AUTOSAR actually fulfill the mitigations that are proposed by the UNR 155? And when we have a look at the matrix again, the first thing we see here is that actually for basically every mitigation that is listed here, AUTOSAR provides at least one security building block that is rated with 1 point. So for every mitigation, AUTOSAR provides a building block that supports you in implementing this mitigation. In addition, also for a number of building blocks, for a number of mitigations, AUTOSAR provides security building blocks that are rated with 2 points, so that that can implement the mitigation already to a great extent. So what does that leave us with? I think from a technical perspective, AUTOSAR does a really good job. It provides security building blocks for basically every mitigation. Some of them even fit this mitigation really well. And taking also into account the wide usages of AUTOSAR and the broad acceptance within the automotive market, I think that AUTOSAR provides a really good basis to implement the mitigations proposed in the UNR 155. However, I would also like to point out here that AUTOSAR can only do so much, because in the end, it's just a piece of software. So you should also think about additional measures to holistically secure your vehicle, for instance, by deploying hardware measures, hardware security measures like an HSM, or also security measures targeting your backend. For instance, the team of security analysts that is analyzing the IDS events that were raised within the vehicle. Okay, with this, I would like to, we are coming to the end of our webinar, so I would like to wrap up what we have presented you in this webinar. In the first part, Moritz showed us the upcoming regulation UNR 155 that states that cybersecurity will become mandatory, and that this will also have an impact on the technical level. After that, Marcel had a closer look at the regulations, especially at Annex 5, where the threats and mitigations are listed. And he also presented a way on how to approach these threats and mitigations by using a rational-based analysis of the technical impact that can already be performed at an early stage of the development. And finally, we had also a look on how to technically implement the mitigations listed in Annex 5, where we think that AUTOSAR is a good candidate due to its wide usage and due to its standardized security building blocks. And in fact, our analysis showed that AUTOSAR provides a really good basis, and the AUTOSAR security building blocks can indeed be used to implement the requirements that are proposed by the UNR 155. So finally, I would also highlight our white paper, Using AUTOSAR to Achieve UNECE-compliant Cybersecurity. We can again find the content that we've presented here on our webinar. We can also again find the matrix mapping the AUTOSAR security building blocks to the UNR 155 mitigations. You can find this webinar on our homepage, ESCRYPT.com, or just by clicking on the picture here on the slides that you will receive afterwards. Thank you for your attention.